class, you can buy AS lecture notes from the office. It's located in the old student center in here. And it's $27 for a subscription if you buy it from now till the end of week 4. And then starting in week 5, it goes up to 32. If I don't get 25 subscriptions, it gets canceled. So, thank you.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I posted probably late last night, very late last night, or maybe it was even very early this morning, the lecture notes on elasticity. So those are available now. Elasticity is the next chapter on in the textbook, and the next topic, or the last topic that we're going to cover for the midterm. So I may introduce that topic today, but I won't get very far into the notes at all. I'll probably just get back to the first page of the notes, if we get to it at all. Okay, so you have an assignment due on Sunday. There's also another assignment due a week from, or this coming Thursday, so the night before the midterm. So that's a homework on elasticity and whatnot. So just keep your eyes open for that. And I know most of the assignments for this class are due on Sunday, but I wanted to get another assignment in on elasticity before the exam next Friday, so that will be due Thursday evening. All right, questions about anything? Logistics?
Yeah. What time is that on Thursday?
I believe it's on at 8 o'clock on Thursday. The due date. Is that what you're asking? I believe it's
Yes.
8. It'll say on the tag, but
All right.
I believe it's at 8. The reason why it's due then is because I want it to be due when customer service is open. So if you guys have problems, technical problems, you can contact me. And they close at 9. Okay. So, all right, so there's a midterm a week from today in class. There are a number of old final exams posted on the class webpage. This year's exam will look like that in format. There will be some number of multiple choice questions followed by 2 short answer questions. The topics covered, chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4. I've said this before, you don't need anything other. The only thing you should have with you is a pencil, a pen, and maybe a straight edge to draw graphs. That's it. No calculators, no blue books, nothing else. Yeah? What are the others? Fine. Doesn't matter to me. Okay. Great. All right, so let's jump into talking about some material. So we have been talking about market equilibrium, and I talked toward the end of class yesterday Wednesday about the fact that the market equilibrium does a nice job of answering those big questions we were talking about. So how much gets produced? That's Q star. Who produces it? Who in society is going to produce it? It's going to be those with the lowest, it's going to be the sellers with the lowest reservation costs, or reservation prices, people usually say. So seller's reservation price is just the minimum amount you have to pay a seller to get them to produce a product. And only sellers whose reservation prices are below the equilibrium price are going to be willing to produce the product. So, and the way to think about this, or another way to think about this, is that the seller's reservation price is really their cost of producing another unit. And obviously, they're not going to want to produce another unit if they're not going to, the price that they can sell that unit for. They're only going to want to produce another unit if the price that they can sell that unit for is greater than the cost of producing it. So again, the market equilibrium is telling us how much is getting produced, it's telling us who is producing it, and it also is telling us who is getting it. So it's going to be the consumers with the highest reservation prices who are going to be purchasing these products. They're going to be the ones who get it, who get the stuff. Now, I had sort of left off with this question of, well, that's an answer to this really complicated set of questions. What gets produced, who does it, who produces it, and who gets it? But we also might want to ask, is this the best outcome? Is this the best way of distributing resources? Is this the best quantity that we could possibly produce? Is this the best decision about who should produce it? Is this the best decision about who should get it? And how do we even define best? So before we, and the answer is going to be that in many cases, I'll just give you a preview, the answer is going to be that in many cases, it is going to be the best solution, and I'll talk about why. But there are also going to be cases in which that's not true. And we want to understand what those cases are. But before we do that, I want to make it clear that markets don't leave any unexploited opportunities for individuals. From an individual standpoint, from the standpoint of the individual actors, and in this case I mean both the consumers and the firms, there are no unexploited opportunities when the market is in equilibrium. And that's sort of what we were talking about when we ended class on Wednesday. And I defined a couple terms. We've gone over these before, but I just want to bring us all up to speed on it. The first was the buyer's surplus. That's the difference between the buyer's reservation price and the price he or she actually pays. And the price that he or she actually pays is typically the market price, whatever P star is. So the buyer's surplus, again, is just going to be the buyer's reservation price minus the market price or the equilibrium price in a very simple setting. And the seller's surplus is going to be the difference between the price that's received by the seller and his or her reservation price. So typically that's going to be the market price, again, minus the seller's reservation price. And then one of the things that we can try and measure is something called total surplus, which is just the sum of buyer's surplus and seller's surplus. And if you sum up buyer's surplus and seller's surplus, and if you sort of think about the fact that the market price that the buyers are going to be facing is going to be the same as the market price that the sellers are going to be facing, at least in this very simple sort of setup, then you can see that total surplus is just simply going to be the buyer's reservation price minus the seller's reservation price. And that makes sense. I mean, if you think about selling something on Craigslist, if I buy something for $100, that I value it, well, forget how much I buy it and how much I pay for it. If I get something that I value for $100, and you sold something to me that you valued at $50, then there was some surplus on that transaction. The total amount of that surplus was $50. This is just the difference between those two things. The difference between the buyer's reservation price and the seller's reservation price. Now, how do we see this graphically? Now we're really getting to exactly where we left off in class on Wednesday. Imagine you're just sort of wanting to know what's the surplus associated with this one last unit that was produced. Okay, not all of the units are for it, but that very last unit that was produced, that Q prime unit. What's the surplus on that? Well, the supply and demand, this sort of picture that we have here tells us something about that. We know that the demand curve tells us the buyer's reservation price. We know that the supply curve tells us the seller's reservation price. And so this distance here between the demand curve and the supply curve tells us a surplus on that very last unit that was sold. Okay, and there's going to be surplus on every unit. And look at all the units that are being sold here. There's the very first unit, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, on and on. The Q prime unit, on and on and on and on and on, all the way up to the Q star unit. Okay, there are all of these units that are going to be sold. And interestingly, there's surplus associated with all of those transactions. And so one of the nice things, when you sort of start to think about the equilibrium in this way, one of the things that you can see is that all of the transactions for which there's surplus take place. Okay, when the market is in equilibrium, all of the transactions, all of the exchanges for which the buyer's surplus is greater than the seller's surplus, all of those transactions take place. And luckily, we don't have no transactions take place where the surplus is negative. So again, for example, here, if we think about a unit of output up here, I'll just call this Q double prime. This distance is still total surplus. But the problem is that it's less than 0. Okay, because buyer's surplus, or the buyer's reservation price, minus the seller's reservation price is going to be less than 0. And these transactions don't take place. Okay, so when we say that there are no unexploited gains for individuals in this equilibrium, what we mean is that there's all of these transactions, all of the gains to individuals that are mutually beneficial take place, and none of the gains that are negative, that sort of reduce surplus, none of those take place. And that's what we mean by there's no unexploited opportunities for individuals. Individuals are, firms and consumers are taking advantage and exploiting and using all of those potential beneficial trades. Okay, so that's something that's really nice about the market equilibrium. Having said that, Just because the market equilibrium doesn't leave any unexploited opportunities for individuals doesn't mean it's socially optimal. Okay, so there's a distinction between everyone can be out there doing the best that they can be doing for themselves on a very individualistic basis, but that doesn't mean that things are as good as they could be for society as a whole. I'll give you some examples of that, but let me give you some definitions first. Let me give you the definition for social optimum. That's the quantity of a good that results in the maximum possible economic surplus from producing and consuming the good. And here we don't just mean the surplus to consumers and producers, we really mean, well, yeah, total economic surplus. So that's the quantity of a good that results in the maximum possible economic surplus from producing and consuming the good. Okay. And as I said before, there are going to be cases in which that equilibrium that we just looked at on the last slide is going to be socially optimal, and there are going to be cases where it's not socially optimal. So where we're going with this is I want to try and lead you into a place where we can understand what are the circumstances under which that equilibrium that we just looked at is socially optimal, and what are the circumstances in which it is not. The second term that I want to talk about is efficiency. It's a slightly different kind of efficiency than what we were talking about earlier when we were talking about comparative advantage. But efficiency occurs when goods and services are produced at their socially optimal levels. Okay, so economists are obsessed with efficiency. We want goods and services to be produced at their socially optimal levels. And that means that, why do we want goods and services to be produced at their socially optimal levels? Because when they are, then total possible economic surplus is going to be maximized. So this picture that we just looked at, it really made it seem like, this what we were going over, really made it seem like we were maximizing economic surplus, because all of these transactions that were taking place were beneficial, and all of the transactions that were not beneficial did not take place. So it seemed like we were in good shape here. It seemed like this should be socially optimal. And usually it is, or I shouldn't say usually, there are cases in which it is, but there are also cases in which it isn't socially optimal. What are those cases? We're finally there. The first condition, or one of the reasons why the market equilibrium may not be socially optimal, is because the demand curve may not equal the marginal benefit of the good to society. Let me sort of add that here. When we were talking about the demand curve, we were saying the demand curve tells us the buyer's reservation price, how much the buyer is willing to pay for an additional unit of the good, how much the buyer benefits from an additional unit of the good. That can be different than the amount that society benefits from the consumption of an additional unit of that good. What's an example? Vaccinations. Okay, when I get vaccinated, I get some benefit of being vaccinated. That benefit is going to be my willingness to pay. It's going to be my reservation price. Whatever that benefit, let's say I value getting vaccinated at $100, that's my reservation price. But the benefit to society of me getting vaccinated is higher than that. Why? Because then I can't get anyone else sick. Okay, so our consumption of certain goods and services brings a benefit to others other than those who are actually consuming the goods. And when that's the case, this analysis that I just did on the previous page, that's not going to hold anymore. We're going to be choosing the quantity that's going to sort of equate the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded for the individuals, but that's going to be different. This demand curve is no longer going to capture the benefit to society of consumption. It only captures the benefit to individuals of consumption. And so we're going to get the wrong outcome. In the case of vaccinations, if vaccinations were purely bought and sold on the market, I mean, there are government programs to vaccinate, but if that were the case, what might we expect? Would we expect that we'd have too little or too much vaccination? Too few or too many vaccinations? If they were bought and sold in a market?
Probably a surplus. I would think you have surplus because there's people out there who cannot, their buyer reservation.
Well, so what I'm suggesting here is so there's going to be a benefit to individuals of consuming vaccinations, and there's going to be a benefit to society, which is going to be higher than that, of consuming vaccinations. And the market equilibrium is determined by equating individuals' willingness to pay and sellers' willingness to sort of produce. But the benefit to society is going to be even higher than that. And so we might expect that the way people typically think that is we might have this under-provision, for example, in this case of vaccinations. Think about it this way. Imagine that the demand curve, actually let me go ahead and drag up there. Imagine that, and you don't have to add this to your notes, I just want to make sure we're clear on this, so I'll do it in green. It's almost like society's demand curve is up here. Right? This is the demand curve for society. It includes the benefits that individuals get, plus the extra benefit that society gets when I get vaccinated. And so the market would want us to have many more vaccinations. If we were to equate the true sort of social demand with supply, we'd have many more vaccinations than we actually do. Okay, and so this is a case where the market is going to get it wrong. Our socially optimal quantity is going to be higher than our equilibrium quantity. Just call it QS for the quantity that society would want us to have. So again, this is a case where we get it wrong. What's another example of this? Cigarette smoke. Okay, when I won't smoke, but let's suppose I smoked. If I smoked, I would presumably get some benefit from each cigarette that I was smoking. But my smoking is going to impose a cost upon other people. And so the benefit to society of cigarette smoking would be less than my own individual benefit. And in that case, we would expect to have an under-provision. We'd expect the market to over-provide cigarettes relative to the social optimum. Okay, so in these cases where the demand curve is not equal to the true marginal benefit of consumption, then the market is going to not deliver an efficient outcome. It's not going to deliver the socially efficient outcome. There are also examples where the supply curve does not equal the true marginal cost of the good. So this could be, and you can sort of talk about this in different ways, but for example, consumption or production entails costs not borne by the sellers. So, for example, let's suppose that a factory is producing something, and they are producing the amount, they're just thinking of their own individual production costs, but they're not internalizing the fact that maybe they're polluting the atmosphere. That's not a cost that they directly have to pay. There's pollution that goes into the atmosphere. Society has to deal with that, but that individual firm can sort of, there's no reason why they should be thinking about that. From a profit maximizing standpoint at least. And so in that case, again, the supply curve would not necessarily equal the marginal cost of producing the good to society. And again, I'm going to add here to society. And so again, we'd end up in this situation potentially where the market equilibrium may not be socially optimal. Okay, so if the supply curve and the demand curve do not reflect all of the costs and benefits associated with production and consumption, then unregulated markets may not always deliver efficient outcomes. So if you think about your consumption of a good, and if it has either costs or benefits to people around you, or if you think about the production of a good, it has either costs or benefits to other individuals, then you would have to worry that the market equilibrium isn't going to be socially optimal. Okay, but if they do, okay, so if the supply curve and demand curve do capture all the costs and benefits, then perfectly competitive markets are efficient. Okay, that is, they deliver the right answer. And so this is really nice. So if you're the social planner and you think that you've been asked to determine what gets produced, who gets it, and where and how is it produced, then as long as you think that the demand curve for that good is going to capture all of the benefits and that the supply curve for that good is going to capture all the costs, then you can just let markets do the job for you. Okay, if it's not the case, if you think that the demand curve and the supply curve don't actually capture all the costs and benefits, then you might have to have some government intervention. And think about the examples that I used. Is there government intervention in terms of providing vaccines? Yes. Okay, there are laws about getting vaccinated. Their vaccinations are often provided at low cost. The government is intervening. What about cigarettes? Well, the government taxes the heck out of cigarettes, okay? They tax them, and that's part of the reason why. That's part of the argument. There's intervention in that market. Pollution, again, the government regulates pollution because the government understands that the market is going to get it wrong. And so a lot of the places that we see the government intervening in the market are cases when something's going wrong up here, where we think the market is not going to deliver the efficient outcome because the supply curve doesn't capture all the costs, or the demand curve doesn't capture all the benefits. Okay. So questions about that? Okay, so now I want to go back and say, let's imagine that we're in this nice situation where we've got a perfectly competitive market. The supply curve captures all of the costs and benefits the demand curve captures all of the benefits to production and consumption. The supply curve captures all of the costs. What happens if we start intervening in a market like that? What happens if we come into a market that's otherwise delivering the efficient outcome and start imposing things like price ceilings? So what is a price ceiling? A price ceiling is a maximum allowable price specified by law. A classic example of a price ceiling is rent controls. So rent controls are usually apartment buildings or maybe even areas of a city where the local government typically has come in and said monthly rents on this apartment can't go above a certain fixed amount. Okay, so let's suppose that we're looking at the market here for one-bedroom apartments, maybe in Manhattan. And let's think about what's going on in a rent-controlled market. So let's suppose that the equilibrium monthly rent for an apartment is $1,000 a month. And let's suppose that the government comes in and says, okay, well, I'm really sorry, but P sub C is going to be the price ceiling. I'm really sorry, but I'm not going to allow prices to go above P sub C. The government says, no, that's it. Prices can't go any higher than this. This kind of rent ceiling will have no effect on the market at all. Okay, because the market equilibrium only wants the price to go up to 1,000. So if the government comes in and says, you can't charge more than $1,500, that's not going to have any impact. The only time price ceilings have impact is when they're imposed below the equilibrium price. So let's look at a price ceiling where the price is set below the equilibrium price. Now we've got some traction. Okay, so now the government says, oh, sorry, we can't make it up to 1,000. We're gonna require you to, the maximum amount that landlords can charge is less than that. All right, well, let's look at the impact of something like this. First of all, a lot of people want to rent this apartment, at least compared to the number of people who actually want to put their apartments up for rent. So one of the first things you see in a market like this is excess demand. Now there's this expression when you're talking about price ceilings and price floors, which we'll talk about next, which is that the short side of the market always wins. All that means is you can't force sellers to rent apartments that they don't want to rent. Okay, so these consumers are just out of luck. In this case, the equilibrium quantity of apartments is determined by the short side of the market, where in this case, the producers are sort of the short side of the market because the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. So in this case, Q sub C is the equilibrium quantity. And actually, for reasons that will become clear in just a minute, I'm going to go ahead and extend this line all the way up to the demand curve. ceiling does is that it limits the number of apartments available in the market, or it's going to reduce the equilibrium quantity of markets. It's also going to reduce the equilibrium price. A couple things are happening here that are worth noting. First of all, notice that there are all of these profitable exchanges in here that aren't taking place. Okay, so there are consumers who would be willing to pay an amount above, way up here for these apartments, and there are producers who would be willing to sell to them if they could charge more than the rent ceiling or the rent control. So producers in here should be trading with consumers up here. They should be they should be renting apartments to one another, but they can't because these producers, they need to be charging a little bit more than piece of C. And when they can't, because of this government regulation, they just decide we don't want to produce. So there are these profitable exchanges in here that don't take place, and this is inefficient. Okay, so this is going to be a source of inefficiency. So that's what I mean when I'm about to write too little or too few apartments. And again, I put too few in quotes here because what I mean here is that there are too few relative to the efficient amount. All right, efficiency, if this market is efficient initially, then we're going to get some inefficiency in this market because of this price ceiling. Now the other sort of interesting thing here that's going on that's worth looking at is that notice that, thinking about that last unit that was actually rented, the consumer's willingness to pay for that last unit is greater than the producer's sort of cost of producing it. And so there's going to be this, this is another way of saying that there's going to be excess demand in the market. The notion here is that there's going to be a lot of, a lot of effort on the part of consumers to get their hands on these rent-controlled apartments. And so if you ever lived in an area where there are rent controls, then you know that there are a lot of sort of funny things that go on as a result of these sorts of inefficiencies. So first of all, and I'll just go through these one by one. First of all, you often have long waiting lists. For rent control apartments. And what I will call wasted search activity. So these waiting lists, I mean, in addition to the fact that they're a pain for consumers who are sort of on the wait list, there's also a lot of, individuals are going to spend a lot of time just sort of spinning their wheels looking for these apartments. They're going to be spending a lot of time and effort and energy not actually producing anything, just searching for one of these rent-controlled apartments. There's some inefficiencies and there's some wastefulness that goes along with that. For example, think about the wait list for ECON1. Okay, so if you're on the wait list for ECON1, there are assignments that you have to be keeping up with, you have to be going to class, there are all of these efforts that you have to exert, even though you may not even get into the class. Okay, it's inefficient. And in fact, there are people in the economics department who think that this is almost like a rent-controlled situation and that we should just charge people more to take Econ 1 and get rid of the waiting list. Because, the equilibrium price is in some sense lower than the higher than the sort of rent-control price. Think of it that way if you want. The other thing, and I encourage this a lot, especially when thinking about this Econ 1 example, is that with these rent-controlled apartments, there are a lot of bribes. So under the table, bribes, and what I'll call black market rent. All right, so people, they get to these landlords and they basically say, I'll pay you an extra $100 a month if you rent this apartment to me. Okay, and what is that? What are they trying to do? Those consumers are trying to bid up the price to the equilibrium price. That's essentially what these efforts are doing. They're saying, I'll pay you more if you just let me have that apartment. The market wants the price to rise. Everyone in the market, other than the government, sort of in some sense, there's this pressure, this upward pressure on prices that is being cut off by the price ceiling. The other thing is that housing quality deteriorates. And here the idea is that with these long waiting lists for apartments, landlords really don't have much of an incentive to maintain the quality of their apartments because there are a billion people who want to rent them. And so a lot of people worry and fear about the quality of housing in rent-controlled areas and the quality of apartments because the landlords just don't have any incentive to make their apartments attractive when they have these long waiting lists. And the last thing that I'll mention, this is similar to the issue above, is that these rent controls often allow landlords to discriminate. And here I mean on the basis of gender, race, religion, whatever. And the idea is that when you've got this long waiting list of people trying to get into your apartment, it's almost like the landlord can just sort of look out at all of those people and pick those who the landlord likes the best and rent to them. Whereas in a market, when there's sort of no excess demand in a market, when quantity supplied is exactly equal to quantity demanded, if the landlord wants to make some money, they're going to have to rent to whoever's willing to pay the equilibrium rent or the equilibrium price, because they don't have a long waiting list. They can't sort of pick and choose who they want to rent to off the waiting list. So there are all of these negative implications or negative things that happen when you impose these sorts of rent controls. And all of these sort of negative side effects are really the result of this. They're the result of this excess demand, and they're the result of the fact that there are too few apartments that are actually being produced or being rented. Okay. Questions about that? Yeah.
So, since there are so many negative implications, why would there even be rent controls when prices will just normalize on their own? Like, why would you rent control knowing that there are these inefficiencies?
I think there was just a lot of political pressure to give rent, to provide housing for the low-income population. And actually, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that in many ways. I mean, you want to have the fear here, the reason why people want to impose these is because you think, well, look, these rents are too high for people for the regular, working people to sort of afford. Okay, we want to have affordable housing, so let's drive the price down. So I think there can be a lot of political pressure, and I think those people may not fully understand all of these negative implications of imposing these sorts of rent controls. Economists, it's not that economists don't care about affordable housing. Economists would say, let's find another way to provide support for the low-income population. Like, why not just give them extra money? There are other things that cut their taxes. Taxes can be distortionary in themselves, so cut taxes or providing some other kind of more efficient way of supporting the low-income population. So economists, this is inefficient, let's find something else. So it's not that economists, this goes back to a theme that we'll touch upon as we talk about efficiency towards the end of the class as well. Economists are obsessed with efficiency not because we don't care about any of those other things, not because we don't care about affordable housing, it's because we kind of think to ourselves, look, we can make economic surplus larger if we just let the market reach its equilibrium. We're going to increase total surplus, and then we can use that extra surplus. Maybe we can tax, maybe we can impose taxes or other sorts of things that we can then use to support the low-income population. And there'll be more economic surplus in which to sort of base those taxes. And so everyone will be better off. And so again, the idea here is let's be as efficient as we can, and then from that starting point, start to think about redistribution and income inequality and those other issues. I don't mean to imply that I don't give a darn about, or the economists don't care about the low-income population. That's not what's going on at all. All right, so other questions. And that point that I just made is going to show up in the next slide, because I also want to talk about price floors, which are, and the classic example of a price floor is the minimum wage. So a price floor is a minimum allowable price specified by law And again, the classic example of this is the minimum wage. So what I want to think about here is the labor market. Okay, and this is a really different kind of market than we've looked at before. This is probably one of the only times in this class where we will look at the labor market. Why is the labor market, and what do I know? First of all, what I mean by the labor market, I mean that, you know, when you go out there and you get a job, you're selling, you're renting in some sense your time in exchange for some money. Okay, that's a market. There's exchange going on there. What are the prices in that market? That's the wage rate. That's why I have W up here on the y-axis, because that's the wage rate. That's the price of, you know, paying someone for an hour's worth of their time, for example. And the quantity you can either think about this as the number of workers or the total number of hours that people are working, either way, for the purposes of what we're going to do here today. But this is the quantity of people who are working. Now, what makes this market really, really different from the other markets that we've talked about is the fact that it's the firms who are doing the demanding. Okay, so the firms are demanding the labor, and individuals or consumers are supplying the labor. Okay, so this supply curve, this is sort of like your supply curve and my supply curve, our labor supply curves. How much are we willing to work given the amount of money that we can get for it? And as you can see, this is upward sloping. The higher is the wage rate. In general, we think the more people are willing to work. Similarly, as wages go up, the quantity of labor demanded, the number of firms who want to hire those people starts to go down. Okay, so it's a little bit different. So just sort of keep that in mind. If we set a minimum wage below the equilibrium price, let's suppose we set the wage at $2 an hour. Again, this will have no effect on the market at all. If the government came in tomorrow, Obama made a big announcement and said, I'm going to change the minimum wage to $1 an hour, right, it would not have any impact on the market relative to the equilibrium without the minimum wage. Right, so that's one thing, or a penny an hour, that's just not going to be a minimum wage that has any bite. In order for minimum wages to have a bite, they have to be set above the equilibrium price. So let's suppose the government comes in and says, no, we need the equilibrium wage to be a little bit higher. Okay, so what's going to happen in this market? Again, just like in the case with price floor or price ceilings,